Do you see the like the future of like social media, internet, like news dissemination and whatnot? Like there's kind of two obvious paths we can go down at this point. Like things can become more centralized, and like more of our information can come from like a handful of outlets, say Google, Twitter, Facebook, and they'll kind of continue to expand until one of them becomes Skynet, and then we all are enslaved. Or there's quite a few people pushing like a more decentralized idea. Like there's people starting to move towards things like locals, or there is a site that for the life of me is escaping me the name, that I listened to Tim Pool talking about it. It's essentially like an RSS feed that compiles stuff you post online, but it's linked to the blockchain, so therefore it never goes away. And it's like everyone has their own like little version of it, and essentially they're talking about creating more like almost like a MySpace sort of style like way of having social media, where everyone would have their own little individual page that would never be deleted, that no one was responsible for except you. And like for me, it seems to be like that those are the two sort of potential avenues in which we can go down. Like, which one do you think is more likely?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, going back, the MySpace model is like, that was the first social media site I was on as well. And I've never been personally a huge social media user, but in the early days of social media, that like it was appealing to me. I mean, I sort of got it. It was a way. It was, I think, what it was intended to be, of individuals able to connect with friends and see what they're doing. And like, yes, there's social problems there, but you had less of this issue that we're seeing now, of it just being a place where we're bombarded with everything from disinformation to just like very toxic points of view that are tailored specifically for you. And I don't find my social media experience generally to be enjoyable at this point. So it's like, do we want to revert back to what it was and what it was meant to be? But I think the question that you raised, initially, of like, this is also, this does go to kind of the ad problem that we were discussing, but a bigger issue of where I think Facebook and Google are moving towards, that I understand as being concerning when you talk about, okay, we're going to prioritize authoritative pieces of information or outlets. So, when people run searches, they're going to get the BBC and New York Times and other sort of credible journalism outlets. Like, that makes sense. But what you don't want to see happen is the sort of destruction of some really great citizen journalists and independent alt media outlets. And so there's this real tension there of like wanting to finance a more diverse, credible pot of information or journalists, while at the same time not wanting to create a financing model where it's almost impossible for some of these startups to compete. And I think so that's a real concern in general as we move forward as well. And I honestly, I don't know the answer there. It's just a clear tension that you don't want to just say like, look, you have all of these, weird blogs that are presenting themselves as being in Tennessee, but they're actually run by like political operatives, and they're pushing out these sort of partisan, half truths all the time. Like, yeah, we want to get rid of those, or at least minimize like those being the things that are showing up in our feeds. But we don't want to create the system like the only thing you're going to be able to see is, BBC, Washington Post, CNN, because I think that destroys, again, the good parts of the early 2000s internet, where you did see this explosion of citizen journalism. So I don't know the answer there, but I think that is the great tension of like, we want to get to a place where you look at the top 10 most shared URLs on Facebook, and 8 of them aren't these just sort of junk news sites, and you're not having your aunt sort of bombard you with these just like absolutely insane stories that come out of these outlets. You're like, I mean, do you know what this site is, kind of thing? Well, at the same time, we don't want to get to a thing where it's like, we only are going to have 10 sources of information that somebody has determined to be credible, and that's it on these platforms. Because one, I just don't think that's a good thing in general. Two, I think you're going to see mass migration to alt platform sites where there's going to be more radical viewpoints. I mean, when you cut off sources of information that people trust, whether they should trust them or not, they're going to go searching for them, and they often go searching for them in darker and darker places. So I don't think that that is a good model to adopt either.
It definitely kind of ruins the, like, if there's say like 5 news outlets or 10 news outlets that are the authority, then like anything that's not them just dies, and therefore it's like it's the same sort of like argument that people make for like free markets in almost everything,
right?
That like you need, if you get bad at your job, say you're the BBC or say you're CNN, and you know like half the country thinks that you're just fake news, that you should start to probably suffer if your coverage is that bad, or if you're not actually providing journalism anymore, you're just providing like outrage, clickbait, political theater,
right?
Which arguably they are. But
yeah, but you know that's the tension. I think the major thing we have to get back to is funding local news outlets. Like in the US, those have just been destroyed. And so, you know, every study has shown that people trust local journalism more than they trust these sort of national, international outlets, because there's no real touch points that they have with those outlets. And so that whether real or perceived, there's this sort of corporate agendas, political agendas behind them that is quite different from your local news outlet, where it's the guy that you see at your kid's soccer game. And, you know, there's just more trust in the information coming there. And those have just been obliterated or taken over by these sort of monolithic corporations. So they're local, but they're not really local because they're owned by the same place and they're given pieces of content to run. So I think that, and I mean, there have been a few models that have outlined how we can do this, but that's one of the things that I think we need to get back towards, where we do have credible journalists. So these are professionals, this is their career, and they suffer when they put things out that turn out not to be accurate. But we don't go to a place where we say, well, there's only 10 outlets we're going to deem to be credible. So I think the solution there is really funding professional news outlets at the local level. So that would be the tension, the way I deal with that tension of just not saying that, like, okay, every news outlet that pops up online is treated equally based on clicks and engagement. We've seen where that goes, and it's not good because it fuels the sort of rage journalism that we've seen in the junk news. But I don't think we also want to go to the thing of like, all right, here are the 10 national news outlets that have gotten the check mark, and that's what you're going to see. So we got to find the middle ground there. And I think the solution is finding a way to fund local, but professional, independent news outlets.
Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.